Okay, well, good afternoon. I have that it is right at 12:30, and I just want to express gratitude for you all being here this afternoon. Thanks for joining us on what I know is a holiday for many of you and a snow day for many of you as well. So thank you for joining us today. I'm Dr. Erica Ollinger, and I get to present on one of my favorite things to talk about for the Beyond or Awareness to Action Summit today. And it's really surrounding this topic of self-care. Um, what I really liked about this morning's presentation was it helped us to think about new ways to be compassionate towards our students, new ways to think about how we interact with them, and really to create healthy and safe spaces for our students and for opening up ourselves to our staff and others within an MTSS framework. So one of the things I'd like to talk about today as well is how we need to extend that same grace, that same compassion, and that same acknowledgement that we don't just come in as teachers every day and leave the rest of ourselves at the door. And we don't just come in as administrators and have the luxury of leaving behind all of the other pieces of who we are in our lives. And that truly, I know self-care is kind of a buzzword right now. And so if we're making an alignment to being trauma aware, I think we're all aware of the buzzword self-care. But what I'm going to encourage you to do today is much like we're moving beyond awareness of trauma in our students, I want to encourage us to move beyond awareness of that there's this word and this concept called self-care. And let's really talk about actions that we can take and why that's important. So as we get started, again, I'm Dr. Erica Ollinger, and I'm in the Office of Student Support at the State Department of Education, and I work as a crisis team school psychologist. And I have with me Trisha Goga, and she is my partner and colleague as the second crisis team school psychologist, and together we do make up the crisis team. And if you'd like to learn more about that, Trisha has a breakout right after this session, the next afternoon breakout session, all about multi-tiered systems of supports within a crisis framework. And she's going to be talking a bit about our crisis team. She's helping me today as my moderator, helping with the meeting. So I'm going to toss it to her for just a second so she can go over some housekeeping and a couple of Zoom rules.
Hi, everyone. It's nice to see so many of you. Around 230 people are here with us today, and I will be monitoring the chat box. So if you have any questions for Dr. Ollinger, you can message me as she will be going through the content, and I can field them to her at select times during the presentation or at the very end. If you'd like to, in the chat box, say your name and what district and what role you play. You don't have to, but you're welcome to. And then we'd also like to just make sure that everyone remains mute so that we can get through this, this great presentation that Dr. Ollinger has put together for us today. And if you have any other questions, again, you can message me in the chat box, or we have our contact information on this presentation.
Okay, thank you, Trisha. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and dive right into our content for today. I do hope that we have some time at the end, potentially for some questions or reflections or discussion, but I would also just encourage you, I know it's a large learning community today, but I would encourage you to interact in the chat and share your thoughts and ideas and comments. And again, I may not be able to see all of them in the moment, but Trisha can help navigate and bring my attention to anything that we need to talk about. So some of the things we're going to do today is really talk again about self-care and taking care of ourselves and our own needs related to trauma as part of a trauma-informed framework and as one of the necessary steps to ensure that we're in a good place to provide the very best of ourselves to support our students, to support our colleagues, and to meet our professional goals. And so I really do view it as part of something we should be compelled to do ethically and to make sure that we're as best suited as we can to provide our services. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. And the first part of the presentation is the less fun part. where I'm going to explore what research tells us about the impacts of not engaging in self-care. And so it's not just like an option or a good idea, but research tells us that we can actually have negative impacts for ourselves and for those we serve if we're not engaging in good self-care. So we'll talk about things like professional burnout and compassion fatigue and secondary trauma. And then I want to shift into the more action oriented part and talk about, well, what are some different things that we can do and different little things we can do to engage in self care and big things. And as a part of that discussion, I want to visit some of the myths or the misnomers, or maybe even things you find that you tell yourself when you start to think about self care. And towards the very end, I want you to just think about if you would like to develop a self-care plan and what that would look like. That could be a structured plan and you can write and take notes, or it can just be things that you reflect on as a part of and after our session today. And I'll give you some tools and resources that you can access to help with that self-care plan. So there's many different definitions, of course, of self-care and many different ways to think about it. This is one of my favorite ways to conceptualize self-care. It's a practice, so it is something that we engage in. It's the practice of taking an active role in protecting one's own well-being and happiness, in particular during periods of stress. And I like that part. And I think it's so fitting right now as we are intersecting different types of pandemics and different kinds of stressors, because it's often easy to take really good care of ourselves when we're not under stress. And that's when it comes naturally to us and we do a really good job at it. And when we are under stress is when we need to be at our best and need to make sure we're at our peak, but we sometimes let that go first and it becomes less and less of a priority. So I like this definition because it emphasizes that during the time of stress and the time when you might feel like self-care should be lower on the list is really the time when it's most important. This next slide, I'm going to give credit to one of my colleagues, Dr. Sarah Rich, who's also a school psychologist in our state. And she created this little graphic and this kind of reflection activity early on, about a year ago with COVID-19. And I really like how it gets us to think about what mode we're in and about how we're all in similar boats, or sorry, excuse me, we're all in similar storms, right? Like we're all working through the pandemic and we're all in education and having to shift sometimes daily with what our jobs as educators look like. And we're all under, the awareness and some of the new ways of thinking around civil unrest and racial injustice. And even today, we're in a literal storm. Like we're all in the middle of a literal snowstorm that is the same for many of us across Oklahoma. But how we react and how we travel through these different and intersecting storms looks very different. And so Dr. Rich kind of conceptualized that some people are on a cruise ship and they're actually doing okay or better than okay. They've found some opportunity, some resilience in this time of need, and they're cruising along and doing okay through this storm. And they're really on a cruise ship. Others get up and feel like every day is a battle, every day is a new struggle, everything's something else I have to work on. And I feel like I'm in a battleship and I'm just always prepped for battle. Some of us are just kind of hanging in a life raft. We've got our close friends and families. We're rowing along. We may not be doing great, but at least we have each other. And some people are fairly lonely and they feel like they're in this humongous storm rowing along by themselves in a rowboat. And there's some other examples of boats there, but I'd encourage you to just think for a moment about which boat you're in today. For part of the day today, I was in a tour boat. I was really enjoying the sessions this morning, and I just really felt like I can navigate this, and I really like what's going on around me, and I like observing and seeing all the cool things that Oklahoma's doing with MTSS and all the places we have yet to go. But that might not have been my boat yesterday. My boat yesterday may have felt a little bit more like a battleship as I'm working through the storm and childcare and the end of the weekend and all of the things that I faced. So I just think it's important to recognize as we're talking about self-care that even though we all may be experiencing the same storm or the same thing, the same crisis, the same pandemic, the same job demands, all of those things are the same. It doesn't mean we're going to react to it the same. And it also doesn't mean that we're going to react to it in the same way today as we did yesterday, as we will tomorrow. And I think that's important to recognize. And one thing I want you to think about as you're developing this sense of self-care is that the point of self-care is to fortify your boat, or better yet, build a better boat to help navigate the rest of the storm tomorrow and moving forward. So that's just one analogy I like to think of. Other reasons it's important to engage in self-care, and again, these are all research-backed reasons. They're not things I made up, and it's not just that it's a good idea, but what research tells us is that we all have a more healthy, balanced relationship with ourselves. P.S. that also strengthens our other relationships with our families, with our students, with our friends. So it's not just that sense of balance with ourselves, but a healthy relationship with ourselves creates healthy relationships with others. It just helps us to know and keep tabs on when our resources are low. And that's important because then we know we can replenish them before they run out. As I mentioned kind of in the opening, it really makes sure that as teachers, as educators, as administrators, that we're physically and emotionally able to provide the best support for our students and families. So we'll talk later about, and I might say it several times today, that one of the myths is that self-care is selfish. And I would say that self-care is actually selfless, because it's preparing ourselves to be the very best we can be, not just for the sake of ourselves, but really for the sake of those that we serve, so that we can put our best foot forward when we're interacting with students and with colleagues and with families in our community. And as mentioned kind of in the title, and one of the next things we'll talk about is that it's proven that engaging in self-care will help prevent certain conditions, to include professional burnout, compassion fatigue, and secondary trauma. And I'll talk about each of those in just a moment. Everybody kind of has a different analogy that they may like when they're thinking about self-care. So some people would say, well, you can't pour from an empty cup, or you can't save someone who's drowning when you can't even stay afloat yourself. I like the cell phone battery one. You wouldn't let your cell phone go to 5% or less. So why are you letting your own self get so depleted? And I think the one I kind of have thought about the longest and that I relate to the most is the notion of the oxygen mask in an airplane. Oh, an airplane, by the way, is before the pandemic, there used to be this thing called travel and vacations, and you'd get in this machine and go across the country. But truly, all kidding aside, hopefully we'll be able to travel soon. But when you're in an airplane, as they're going through the safety spiel and they're telling you how to buckle your seatbelt and where the exits are, they also say that if the plane gets in a situation where it's depleted of oxygen, which we all know is needed to live, if the plane becomes depleted, oxygen masks are going to fall. And they always say, make sure you put on your own mask first before assisting others. So don't put it on children first, or the elderly, or other people who are struggling that you'd like to help. You've got to put it on yourself first. And that's how I think of self-care. If you don't have on your oxygen mask, then not only are you going to pass out, which is a problem, and you're not going to have the needed necessities of life, you won't have oxygen to breathe, but you're also then not helping anyone else around you. And so it serves you no purpose to let yourself become depleted. So that's one way I like to think of self-care. And you guys might have other analogies or other ways that you think of it. And I'd love for you to share those in the chat and discuss that a bit. So why, again, is it important to engage in self-care? And another reason is just because it really puts us at risk for some pretty severe outcomes if we're not engaging in self-care. So the first one I'd like to talk about is professional burnout, okay? Again, several different definitions. I'm sure many of us can relate to the person in the graphic here. But professional burnout is a form of extreme chronic stress that leads to physical and mental exhaustion, but not just the exhaustion piece, but that's paired with behaviors. And those behaviors might result in detachment, in cynicism, and really with feelings of being professionally ineffective. So we all feel a little bit of burnout, and we have our whole lives. It's always like, okay, I'm so glad it's Friday because I'm burned out and I need the break, or we're waiting for spring break or for that really fun thing to happen. So, our profession ebbs and flows. We don't love what we do every second of every day. But when we're talking about professional burnout, that's when you're starting to think about, I don't want to be in this career anymore, or I want to be in this career. I just don't feel like I belong here anymore. So not just the tired and the needing a break, but that accompanied with, I don't feel right about what I'm doing and I'm thinking of trying something else. So some of those symptoms, and this is a short list, there are others, might be things like depersonalization, extreme or extended times of troubled concentration. So not being able to focus on one thing or get your task done. If you find that you're starting to have that negative attitude towards your students or your colleagues, that's preventing you from feeling like you're doing your best work, difficulty sleeping, and then because you're kind of feeling detached from the profession, you might find yourself compromising your own boundaries or your own ethics in ways that you wouldn't have previously done. So again, not engaging in self-care puts us at more risk for professional burnout. It also puts us at risk then for what we call secondary traumatic stress, or I'll just probably refer to it as secondary trauma. And that's where even if you're not the one that's experiencing the trauma, because we're in a caring profession, because we are situated professionally in a place where we know about and hear about and interact with students and our friends and our colleagues who themselves are experiencing trauma. Secondary traumatic stress is essentially where, after hearing that for so long, or helping with that for so long, or just being around and ingrained in that so long, you start to take on the trauma as if it is your own. So the essential act of listening to trauma stories or knowing about the trauma that people are experiencing compromises your professional functioning. And we see this a lot in the caring professions and in the service professions, and certainly in education. We're all in the same storm of the pandemic, of related stressors, of the fallout, and all of the pieces that come along with our work right now. But for some of us, even if it hasn't affected us very much personally, and we haven't had COVID-19, or we haven't had a family member who's had it, or we're still in a pretty good boat as we're motoring along, that doesn't mean that we also can't have effects from those that we know are hurting and experiencing trauma and suffering. So some of the things that you might see from secondary trauma would be, again, similar to what we saw with professional burnout. You might see that you're numb or detached. You might feel isolated. We see anxiety. So you take on the anxiety of those experiencing the trauma. Again, things like extreme fatigue, not being able to get your work done. This one often has an element of hopelessness, because even our speakers this morning were talking about, well, we can't fix it all. And so sometimes when we feel like we can't fix it all, or we can't make it all better, that causes us to lose hope a little bit, and really results in a much more negative self-view and worldview. And then kind of the last outcome potential, the last thing that we might be at risk for is compassion fatigue. And compassion fatigue is sort of unique to those who are working with people. Like, anybody can have professional burnout, right? You can be a model and have professional burnout, and you can be an accountant. But compassion fatigue is sort of unique to those of us who work in the helping and service professions. And it's really just that because we're caring and tending to and trying to teach and educate others, we start to experience traumatic stress ourselves just by virtue of being the carer or the caregiver. And so a lot of times that means we lose interest. And in fact, the very thing that got us in the profession in the first place, which is our caring and compassion from others, starts to wane. So some of the things that you might see is that you're hypervigilant, and it's almost like you're looking for crisis all the time, even though you shouldn't be. Poor boundaries. You might be avoiding your work or avoiding students or avoiding colleagues that normally you would be very happy to interact with, that sense of numbing again, that chronic illness again. This one also has those elements of anger or cynicism. The world's never going to get better, hopelessness perhaps. And then again, this one is also marked by feelings of feeling like you're not doing your job well, because you've just run out. You've run out of empathy. You would love to care, but you just feel like you can't care any more than you already have. So each of these things probably sounded very similar, and they are. And so I've kind of summed them up here in one little graphic that you might look at and think, they all are related. They have some overlap. And at the end of the day, I just conceptualize it as the cost of caring. We can be the most compassionate educators, and we can be people who have so much empathy and so much passion for education and for students and for what we're trying to achieve. But what we know is that that doesn't come without a cost. And the most extreme cost, the most extreme price we could pay is that we start to experience things like burnout, secondary trauma, compassion fatigue. Oh, and because I'm being so positive right now, I would also say that in addition to that list of things that I just mentioned, those symptomologies, those things you might be seeing or experiencing or feeling, unfortunately, compassion fatigue, burnout, those types of things don't have just that cost, but often result in physical and mental costs as well. So long-term things that are harmful to us. So things like those with extreme compassion fatigue are more at risk for a lowered immune response, more at risk for heart trouble, to include cardiovascular disease and high blood pressure and stroke, more at risk for cancer, certainly more at risk for things like anxiety disorders, mood disorders, those types of things, and more at risk for things like addiction to alcohol or other substances. So there's kind of a physical and a long-term toll as well when we're talking about the most extreme price that we pay sometimes as those who are caring. I like this graphic. It says your heart is slightly bigger than the average human heart, but that's because you're a teacher. And I think that's true. I think that especially those teachers out there, I admire you all so much. And I'm so grateful for those who are in buildings or in behind virtual screens, making the most of what's been handed to us and what we're trying to navigate every day. And I love that we do. We have bigger hearts as educators, perhaps, than other people who are experiencing the pandemic and the stress right now. But with that big heart also comes big responsibility. And what I want you to know is that your responsibility isn't just to others. With your big heart, you also have a big responsibility to take care of yourself. And so I want to now move into what is the action? What is the hopeful piece? What is the positive side of and the ways that we can work through these issues of potential for burnout or compassion fatigue or secondary trauma. And so the hope is that research tells us that we have an action, we have an intervention, and we know at least one thing that works to prevent professional burnout, to prevent compassion fatigue, and to prevent secondary trauma and all of those associated short-term, long-term, physical, emotional, and psychological effects that we would have the potential to have. And the hope is self-care. So now let's talk about what self-care can provide. I like to end on that or get into that and get away from some of the negative impacts. So again, even in something like a pandemic, what we know is that people who practice and exercise self-care will have more energy. They show an increase in physical health benefits, increased life satisfaction and happiness, even amidst crises, better relationships, a better balance of life demands and a better ability to juggle the rest of the life demands, and a better sense of control. So I like to tell people right now that educators don't have full plates, they have full platters. And truly engaging in self-care helps you to balance that platter and helps things to keep from falling off or from getting old. So those are some of the benefits. Other ones is that, of course, stress reduction, increased mental health benefits, an ability to just do our jobs better. A few moments spent on ourselves really does help the rest of the day as we're trying to plan and grade and log on to Zoom and get things ready and make family connections and check in on those students, and all of those other things become more manageable and you become more effective if you take care of yourself first. It helps us to gain perspective. I like this one. It helps to model for others, for our students, for our own families, for our colleagues, that this is what healthy navigation through a crisis looks like. And it helps them to understand that they also have a right to self-care and to setting up boundaries and to gauging activities that make them their best selves to come and join you as students and as colleagues. So it's really encouraging and modeling for others that when we're at our best selves, we're at our best for others. And then, of course, in the crisis literature, it tells us those that engage in good self-care really do have increased recovery. It takes less time for resiliency, hope, and recovery, and some of those other outcomes post-crisis to become a reality. So, one way to think of it is it facilitates the getting back to normal, and not just the getting back to normal and that we can be in physical spaces again, or we can get on that airplane again, but that normal of, I feel like I'm a capable educator. I love that I'm doing this for kids and for students. So the recovery in terms of psychological and emotional normal as well. Okay, before we get into developing our plans, I just want to hit on the head some of the myths or the lies, or maybe just some of the hesitations and some of the things that you may tell yourself as you're thinking about your self-care plan and your ability to practice self-care. So one is that I'm going to give you a whole list of strategies coming up. And my intent is in giving you these strategies isn't to make you feel guilty. If you haven't done a good job of your self-care recently, I'm not here to make you feel guilty. I'm here to put tools in your hands and to get you on the road to where we need to be. And it's certainly not something that is supposed to go on your to-do list as just more things to do. Because if it feels like that, then whatever's on the list probably isn't truly self-care. Also, I'm looking at this picture and I'm thinking, man, wouldn't we all love to be on that beach in the warmth, in the sun, getting that massage right now? Yes, I think we would. And while we might like that, and that might be something that we would enjoy, self-care doesn't have to be extravagant. It doesn't have to be expensive. It doesn't have to be vacations to exotic locales or buying yourself a new car. So extravagance isn't what defines self-care. And in fact, what a lot of research shows is that putting smaller, manageable, consistent, tiny little pieces of self-care into your daily life in the long term is much more effective than a one-shot, 1 week vacation on the beach. Is vacation on the beach self-care? Sure, of course it is. But first of all, it's hard to attain. It's certainly hard to maintain. And again, I don't know that that's as effective in the long term as instead tiny, free little things that we can put in our lives day to day that really does equal self-care. It's also not a quick fix. And so it is something that has to be maintained. One trip to the beach isn't going to do it. Potentially changing one habit isn't going to do it. It's something that needs your attention and it needs some consideration and some consistency to be the most effective. And kind of the weird thing about human nature is that the times when we really should, again, we're at crisis and it really would be healthy for us to be at our peak, seems to be sometimes when we adopt the least healthy coping mechanisms we can. So a lot of times in the time of crisis, we find that we're going to sleep too much, or we're not going to sleep enough, or we're going to stop that healthy diet plan, or sometimes we resort to things like drugs and alcohol or unhealthy relationships, because in the short term, oversleeping feels better. In the short term, having those 2 or 3 extra glasses of wine might feel like we're doing better. But most of the time, those strategies are avoidant and in the long term, very harmful. And so it's something to be mindful of, that our human nature is often to turn to things that are going to result in the exact opposite of self-care just because they feel good in the moment. Other things to think through is that self-care has to be time consuming, and it doesn't. Self-care can be as small as on once a week on Sunday. I did this myself last night. I'm going to put my little pill organizer that has my medications and my vitamins next to my bed on my nightstand with a bottle of water. That took me 2 minutes. And so it wasn't time consuming, but it's something that I need to do for my physical health. And I feel better knowing that I'm taking care of my body in the way I should be. So tiny little things like that. I also, and you guys, again, feel free to share your experiences. I also often this is my guest room. You can't tell that the broadcast is from my guest room, but I'll just light a candle before I start my day and get on my Zoom meetings and do all the work I need to do, because just having that scent and that aroma to me is soothing and helps me through the day. So it doesn't have to be expensive or time consuming. And then again, just make sure that as we're talking through these strategies, which we'll get to next, that it's not the same for everybody. And notice that the word self is in self-care. And so you have to kind of plan out what is best for you and what nourishes and replenishes you, which may look different to different people. So I'm the type of person who it is better for me in terms of my self-care to check things off a list and feel like then I can be fully present with my family. So sometimes for me, and this isn't for everybody, but sometimes for me, working an extra 20 minutes to get 2 more things checked off my list makes me more present for my family in the evening, because I'm not worrying about those 2 things. One of my best friends is the opposite, and self-care for her is stopping at 5:30 every day and not thinking or looking at work till the next morning when she has to report to work. So just know that both of those are okay, and that just because your self-care doesn't look like your best friends or your husband's or anyone else around you, if it's replenishing for you, it's self-care. And then, as we've talked about, self-care is not selfish. In fact, it is selfless, because what's more selfless than preparing ourselves to be our best so we can serve others? Especially if we know that we haven't prepared ourselves, our service to others may be compromised. Okay, so we're going to go through some different domains of self-care, and I've put on my slides some ideas for different ways that you could engage in self-care for each of these domains. And again, this is a time where I would love for you to share ideas in the chat. Think of other things that work well for you, so that we leave today with a big set of tools in a toolbox, and we can choose the ones that we think will be most effective. So when you're creating your self-care plan, just a couple of things to think about. Start with the basics. So unless you can just really afford it and you have the time, Mexico Beach vacation with a massage every day at 2 o'clock is probably not where you can start. So especially if you're feeling super depleted right now and you're on this session with me today because you're feeling that burnout, that compassion fatigue, that secondary trauma, then it's okay to start small. I'm going to take my multivitamin every day and I'm going to put it by my bed to make sure that I do that. I'm going to call Aunt Becky today because I've been putting it off for a week and I could really stand to hear her laugh. So sometimes starting with the basics and starting small is going to be more sustainable. And those very small things, again, one small thing might not do it. 2 small things may not do it. But 3 or 4 small things will have a cumulative effect that might actually be more healthy and more sustainable than beach vacation in Mexico. I catch myself in this cycle. So beware of what is called sometimes the must be nice phenomenon, where you say, well, it must be nice that you had your vitamins and you got that ready yesterday because I could barely hold it together. Well, it must be nice that you have nice smelly candles because I don't have any and I can't even drive to Walmart right now because I'm snowed in. So a lot of times when we are developing our self-care plan, we think about how others engage in self-care, how nice it must be to be in their green pasture. And just remembering that the grass isn't always greener, and that what you should really be thinking about is what would be nice for me. What is something that I can do for me, and not begrudge others who are engaging in this work, and particularly if they're engaging in it differently than you are. I always just think of it as renewal in terms of what will replenish me. What is that oxygen mask, or what would fill up my cup so that then I could pour on to others? Small activities every day. When I say let your compassionate voice speak, that was kind of when I opened also, like, show compassion towards yourself. Take trauma informed actions towards yourself in the same way that we're learning to take those actions towards students. So have that same kind of love and compassion towards yourself, and you'll be better at showing love and compassion and trauma informed practices to your students. And clearly, I would advocate for making self-care a priority. Okay, if you'd like to take notes, I'm just checking the time. If you'd like to take notes, or even just type something up on your computer or on your cell phone, or even just reflect, you don't have to pick up a pen or start typing things. But as we're talking through these different domains, just think about one or two of those little things that you can do to support your self-care. So what are some little things? And I'll try to share some of mine if they're not on the list. And of course, share in the box. And then think about what are two big things. So what are some of those bigger things that would seem more luxurious, or that might cost a little bit more, but in some ways would help me to replenish? Also, as you're building your self-care plan, I think it's critical to think about how you're going to monitor this. So in an MTSS system, we're monitoring our students' progress on their academic skills, or on their behavior skills, or on their, how they're doing with their mental health needs. So how would you monitor your self-care plan? And so I do have a couple of friends who have checklists or calendars, and that they're those, type A type of people that like to check off what was on their plan and plan it out. I have on my phone, I receive a text from a colleague of mine at 7 o'clock every morning. So usually when I'm kind of up and getting around and getting the kids out of the house, and it's just a subscription service, and it's just like, it's a quick text. I read it in 2 seconds, but it's an encouraging method for the day. And then again, at about 5 o'clock when I'm closing out, I'll be honest, about 6 o'clock when I'm closing out my workday, I get another reminder with just something quick to read, but that time it's a joke. So I end my day with the joke of a day, just to give myself a little bit of humor. So something like that helps to monitor and keep you on track. There's a lot of excellent apps right now that you can download for your phone or computer. I know a lot of people express through journaling or through artwork about their self-care plan. And then also this notion of having accountability partners. So having a colleague that helps you stay on track, that says, hey, were you able to do your exercises today? That's great. How many miles did you get in? Or, hey, did you end up calling Aunt Becky? How's she doing? And so having those partners to help not guilt you into it, but to support you and to help keep you accountable to some of the goals that you set. Okay, so physical is one of the easy ones to think about, because we all know that we should be eating well, that we should be exercising, and that we should be sleeping. And those are three of the hardest things to do with any consistency. So those things are on there. I would encourage you to think about them in different ways. So we often get discouraged when we say, okay, I'm going to stop eating carbs today, and I'm just going to totally switch over to this. And what we know is that you're more successful in eating well if you ease into it. So set some small goals. Exercise doesn't have to be buying a Peloton bike and pumping it out for 45 minutes and sweating it out with the hundreds of other Peloton users across the nation. If you're able to do that, power to you. I'm so proud that you're able to do that. But for me, exercise works more like getting down and wrestling with my kids and my pets in the living room at night, going on walks around the block with my husband. And so is that as good as a Peloton workout? Maybe not, but it's something that I can sustain right now. Other things like stretching, really practicing deep breathing, certainly limiting your substance abuse, tiny things. And I did this myself, where one week I scheduled my dentist appointment. The next week, I went ahead and scheduled my dermatologist appointment, and I felt good about it. I'd been putting all of those things off because I had too much work, and that was not a priority on my list. I had these emails to get to and these plans to make, But just scheduling one a week, now I'm on track and I feel so much better because I'm taking care of myself and my family. Certainly drink waters, absolutely try to spend some time outdoors, and sometimes just taking little breaks, even if they're 2-minute mind breaks, can be so meaningful. As can the last one. I like the last one on here. Hug and just snuggle with a loved one every day, a spouse, your kids, family members, friends, a pet, or a snuggly. All of those things are good for ideas for physical self-care. Social self-care, and social intersects a bit, social, emotional, and psychological, which we'll go through. Those intersect with one another. But of course, I'm glad that I think almost a year into this, or a year into this, we found ways to be better virtually connected. Here in our student support office, once a month, we get together and it's an optional lunch and learn, and we just play silly games with one another. And it's over Zoom, and it's not as fun as if we were in the same room, but you should see some of the ladies presenting today and how crazy they get about Zoom Pictionary. I'm just telling you. So there are some fun ways to stay socially connected. Keep those family routines that you may have, whether they're meals or games or prayers at night, whatever it is, those family rituals that are socially meaningful for you. Random acts of kindness, so important right now, and something that can replenish so many people. Relationship building. If you haven't gotten a COVID pet, I know a lot of people, we adopted 2 kitties ourselves recently, but adopting and caring for a pet or a plant if you don't want the hair, right? So interest groups, hobbies, all of those things. And again, you don't have to go full-fledged. You don't have to start the book club. Just join one. And if you don't go every time, give yourself grace for that too. So just find the things that are meaningful for you socially. What would replenish you right now? Emotional self-care. So again, a lot of these things are going to intersect with the social and the psychological. Maintaining a schedule. So especially during times that are unpredictable, like, COVID-19, like, are we going to be virtual or in person this week? Oh, we were going to be in person, but now there's a snowstorm. So the more predictability you can build in amongst unpredictable circumstances, the better off you are mental health wise in your emotional state. Practicing, of course, your faith, your spiritual beliefs, those types of things. Don't let those fall off your platter. I know your platter's heavy. Don't let those fall off. Trying to engage in a new hobby, just quiet time. And quiet time is huge. And so whether you're the person who likes to take a bubble bath or have morning coffee, I like to go sit in my sunroom and see if I can watch any birds for a few minutes a day. But even just 2 to 5 minutes of quiet time can be huge. And then again, there's lots of apps and lots of great ways to engage in calming strategies. So learning about self-talk or listening to music or visualization. And there's awesome apps that lead you through those kinds of activities. And I'll have some as part of our resources when we close in a few minutes. Reduce your media exposure. And so, there's no need to have the news on blaring 24 hours a day or to check your Facebook, particularly if you have a lot of negative pages and a lot of negative people in your Facebook feed. Just taking a moment away from social media in particular, but any type of traumatic media exposure is helpful. And I had to learn that lesson and learn to limit myself of I'm going to get COVID updates once every 3 or 4 days because it was too much for me to be reading every single day. And that's okay. Things like talking about, journaling about, or noticing gratefulness, goodness, beauty, kindness, hope, and humor. So I'm telling you that one once a day corny dad joke app that sends me a joke at 6:00 p.m. really is helpful for me because almost every time it makes me just chuckle a little at myself or at the joke. So even tiny things like that can be helpful. And then you've probably read about or heard about on this last bullet, this notion of what we call toxic positivity. And that's the notion that we shouldn't be telling ourselves, nor should we be telling others, everything's great. You're going to have a great day. Everything is wonderful, right? Like we should be optimistic and have hope, but it's emotionally healthy to acknowledge I'm struggling right now. I am on the struggle bus today. Or to tell others, hey, it seems like you're having a hard time, and that's okay. And so it's healthy to acknowledge, we are humans built with a range of emotions, and it's healthy to acknowledge and address each of those emotions. And that's much more healthy than pretending like the negativity doesn't exist and just letting it stay buried. And it's more helpful to others if we acknowledge, I'm struggling right now today, and I would like to help you with that, but I think I need to take some space for myself. That's going to make you a much better helpful person to, much more helpful to that person the next day than if you go ahead and help them and you're feeling resentful and mad and anxious the whole time you're with them. So just wanted to bring that up because I've seen a lot of things recently in the news and different places about toxic positivity, and just know it's healthy to acknowledge, experience, and then find action towards resolving negative feelings. So the caveat is don't just acknowledge them and say that you have them, but plan some action to address them. Okay, psychological self-care. So if you're to that point where you think, I heard what you said, and I definitely think I'm having some compassion fatigue because I just don't want to do this anymore. And I don't want to get out of bed, and I don't feel like helping anybody, and I don't feel like being on Zoom and teaching those students, or whatever those feelings may be, then it's okay to start to engage in, maybe you need to visit a therapist or a psychologist, look up a counselor, talk to your priest, to your pastor, to your minister, because there are professionals who can help when we get into those extremes. If you're not quite ready to take that step and see a mental health professional, things like, again, meditation and prayer, journaling, mindfulness, any of those things, physicians can be helpful in letting you know how to navigate and what you should be looking for. And then just sometimes just acknowledging it, saying it out loud, writing it out, and revisiting that, or being mindful, and I'm feeling this way, but I have a plan to help to feel better, is good. And then cognitive reframing, which is it's a technique that we teach ourselves, and it's like any other skill or that we're teaching ourselves, where we have to learn how to do this. It's not something that happens naturally, but it's where you take a thought that's negative or bad, or a perception that's negative or bad, and you engage in steps to reframe it into something that you can take action on. So notice I didn't say sugarcoat it or turn it into something positive, but reframing is, how can I reframe this in a way that now I can address it and take action for it? And again, I have a resource that might help with cognitive reframing that we'll get to, and that I don't know if she has it ready because I didn't ask her to, but we might have Trisha drop in the box. And then, of course, there's professional and work-based care, work-based self-care. And I know that this doesn't exist in a vacuum, and that this also takes the support of your administrators. For my principals and superintendents and administrators, you know, this is something that you also have to model and encourage in your employees in your district. Teachers, this is something that you need to model and encourage each other with. And anybody else on the call, just engage in professional self-care, and recognize that we professionally, we don't live in a vacuum. So as much as we can help encourage others in these activities, the better off that we'll be. So setting your boundaries, turn off that cell phone, cut off the email, put in the disclaimer that says Mrs. Smith does not check her email between the hours of 7 p.m. and 7:30 a.m. or whatever your boundary is, and stick to that. And it's okay. It's okay to have that boundary. If to the extent that you can, and ask for flexible work times, ask to share shifts, or if you can't do that, how can we rethink responsibilities? How can we share in our teaching community how responsibilities may look different? Districts should have employee assistance programs that have a number of different ways to foster and encourage your self-care. You can set up or join employee support groups. Celebrations are huge. And I know sometimes they feel kind of corny or cliche, but creating meaningful celebrations for yourself and for your colleagues is important. And taking the few moments to do that once a week, or as we start the staff meeting on Zoom, or whatever it happens to be, well thought out, genuine and meaningful celebrations go a long way in to create a safe and more caring workplace. This one's hard, and this is, Erica has a hard time. This one, it's okay to say no. Practice knowing your boundaries and knowing when to say no is important, as is, if I don't have it on here, I do, asking for help. We would want our students to ask us for help rather than struggle through a concept that they don't know how to do. We wouldn't want them to be discouraged. We wouldn't want them to learn to do something the wrong way. We always want our students to raise your hand and ask for help, or go off mute and ask if you don't understand or if you need help or support. So we need to model that ourselves. And if we are struggling and we need help and support, my guess is our bosses, our administrators, our colleagues don't want us to struggle. They'd rather help us and see us succeed. And then just know, and this one's hard too, to set realistic work expectations. It's almost been a year, and I sometimes wonder if we're still expecting too much out of ourselves and each other, because we're still in a crisis, and we know that productivity doesn't look the same during a crisis. And so to the extent that you can, be realistic in what you can and should be able to get done in a day. Okay, I've just got a few more minutes, and I want to leave time in case there's something I need to attend to from the chat. But one of the materials that we do have is essentially this list, curated from the State Department of Education, and it's called Self-Care for Teachers and Educational Professionals. And you just see a screenshot of it here, but it's actually several pages. And you'll notice that some of the things in blue are things that there are links for. So there's a link for that cognitive reframing activity I spoke of. There's links for some common apps that might help you with some of those breathing or mindfulness activities. So anything that's in blue is something that we would have linked to this document. And if Trisha can drop that in the box, I'd appreciate it. But if not, you just have to go to the OSDE website and look for self-care, or anywhere where we have our COVID-19 resources listed, and this should be in the list. Or you can email me, that would be fine too, and I'm happy to just send it directly your way. I'm going to come back to this one. Actually, I'm going to skip that to say some of the other resources that you might find helpful is there are some tools that can help screen for, am I experiencing burnout? Do I have compassion fatigue? Like, you don't have to decide by yourself. So I've just listed here 2 tools that if you wanted to just take them, just to see where you fall, helped you to make some decisions or to craft a self-care plan, these might be helpful for you. So one looks at professional quality of life and one looks at compassion fatigue. Again, I would say though that the screening in itself isn't helpful unless it results in an action plan. So use the screening not just to say, oh man, this is wrong with me, but rather to say, okay, well now I know some areas that I need to work on or that would improve my health if I worked on them. If you want a more structured plan, so something to really help you be strategic and how you're planning for self-care, I've included the Vicarious Trauma Toolkit, and that's helpful for all kinds of first responders and people in the helping professions. And then out of SUNY in Buffalo, there is the Developing a Self-Care Plan. These are just 2. I provided them for you, but if you use your Google Foo, and you can find many other ones. These are just 2 that I like that are here, so you don't have to search if you don't have the time to. And then of course, after we've screened, after we've come up with a plan, these are some additional resources that might help you carry out with fidelity and implement your self-care plan. So one is a workbook, and again, it's specifically designed for those in the helping professions. It's from the National Center for Family Homelessness, but people who aren't engaged in work with the homeless can find benefit from this. I really like this workbook. And then another one is a book, a study book that's understanding and addressing vicarious, or that would be the secondary trauma. So things to screen, things to help you screen, things to help you plan, and things to help you act or implement some self-care plans. Some other things that I would just advise that you think about, whether you're coming up with one of these formal plans or as you're just reflecting on the short time we had together this afternoon, some questions that may help as you're developing the plan is just really think back to, why did I choose to be a teacher or a principal or a school psychologist or whatever it is that you're doing professionally? Why did I choose to do that? And what is it that keeps me going? Even if it's slow going these days, what is it that keeps me going? Really spend some time on the second one. What is it that would bring me nourishment? So not as what self-care that others are doing, not what is self-care that feels like a burden or another thing on the list, but what are some things that I could develop into a plan that would bring me nourishment? We talked about the monitoring piece. Create a journal, get a accountability partner, download some apps, find a way to hold yourself accountable um, so that you can stay on track. Identify your own warning signs as well, and just be very honest and mindful with yourself. What are some things that I think would lead to my burnout or my compassion fatigue or my secondary trauma? And then as much as you can, identify what are your barriers and how can you help overcome them. So having a plan for, it's better to plan for those barriers and be ready when they come along than to ignore them, and they're going to come along anyway. Think about what negative strategies you might engage in that you could improve on or that you could avoid. And then I also like, this is kind of an optimistic closure to this plan, is if I implemented this plan, if I engaged in some of these nourishing activities and self-care, what research tells us is that you're going to be healthier yourself. It also tells us that you're going to be more effective when you serve students and families. You're going to have better relationships with the people that are important to you. But besides what the research tells you, think about how your life would change if you implemented a plan. Okay, so I think that just about closes out my content, except to say, how deep is this mud? Or in this, for today, I should have changed it to how deep is this snow? And sometimes it depends on who you ask. And so make sure that your self-care plan is focused on the self and that it's meaningful for you. If I can be helpful, or the crisis team in general, this is the contact information for me and my colleague Trisha Goga. So our emails are there, our phone numbers are there, and then we do have a website as part of the larger State Department website, so you can visit us there. We do have some self-care resources on there. And again, I'll remind you that in the next breakout, Trisha Goga is going to talk about crisis response in an MTSS model, and more specifically about some of the other services our crisis team provides. So I have that it's 1:27. Trisha, if you're there, is there anything I need to be mindful of or looming questions and concerns?
There are no questions in the chat box, but there were a few that mentioned throughout the presentation. They asked if this PowerPoint would be available, which I do not know the answer to that, but do you?
I don't know if it will be available as part of the summit today. However, if it's not, I am happy if you just shoot me an email. I'll put this back up. If you shoot me an email, I am happy to send it out individually to anybody that would like it. And I do know this session was recorded. And so I think maybe even as soon as in the next couple of days, all of the breakouts and keynotes from the summit will be recorded and available on the OSDE website. But if these print materials are not, email me and I'm happy to shoot them your way. Excellent. Anything else, Trisha?
Just one more reminder, if you would like to receive a certificate, you need to fill out the survey on the presentation slide here. You can use the QR code, or I can drop a link in the chat box right now.
Thank you for that link, Trisha. I just also want to express gratitude to colleagues. Amanda Sellers helped contribute to this work, as did Dr. Sarah Rich. And then at the end, there's other resources and references if you email me, or if it's posted online. So please fill out that survey. I'm grateful for you all. I wish you a happy self-care journey, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. So thank you so much. And everyone, just take care of yourselves and stay warm. Bye-bye.